Evening and good night to those around the world. As Jim Carrey said in The Truman Show, I am the director of programming for the Brooklyn Antiquarian Book Fair Virtual Edition 2020. My name is Brian Chittister, and you'll see me throughout the day introducing the various speakers that we have. Just a quick reminder, you go to www.brooklynbookfair.com to view any of the individual talks that we have today, to view the online exhibition we have of the Beach Boys, and also to click onto the actual virtual book fair itself. We have over 3,000 objects for sale and 225 virtual booths. And I'll be bringing up some different books that are related to the topics that are being discussed in the webinars throughout the day. Probably after the speakers speak, I'll let you know if you enjoyed the talk that you hear, which I'm sure you will. I will bring up some books or objects that you can buy from the different dealers or peruse. And we had the preview yesterday, and quite a few books actually already sold, but you can still view them and they're really cool. But there's still quite a lot available. So I encourage you, if you enjoy the talks, to go and follow some of the books that I'm mentioning, and also to enjoy the fair. Our first speaker, who I'm really excited about, is coming up, is an artist and art historian named Alessandro Keegan. And I met Alessandro about 6 or 7 years ago. We both did our master's work at Brooklyn College in art history. And he's also a fine artist, a painter. And a lot of his work is, there he is, a lot of his work is focused on mediumistic or very spiritually inspired abstract art. And he's going to show you some of his work, as well as a lot of other stuff from, you know, the historical canon of mediumistic art, which is just sort of coming into vogue now in the mainstream, and with you know, museum curators and whatnot. But for a long time, it was sort of the purview of the underground, and he'll go through that as well. But quickly, I just wanted to tell you that from noon to 1 today will be Alessandro's webinar, and then after that at 1:30, we're going to have a webinar on alchemy and dreams from an alchemist practitioner named Brian Cotte-Noir, who we had last year at the live Brooklyn Antiquarian Fair. At 3 o'clock, we will have Secret Spells from the Last Daughter, which is a talk about witchcraft from an actual magic practitioner. And at 4:30 p.m., that's Eastern time, we will have Michael Horse, aka Deputy Hawk, from the cult series Twin Peaks. So it's going to be a great day. And without further ado, I turn it over to Alessandro Keegan.
All right. Thank you, Brian. I'm going to share my screen now and get my talk started here. All right, there we are. I hope everyone can see this and it looks fine. As Brian introduced me, I'm an artist and an art historian. I'm going to be saying a little bit about myself, but I first wanted to introduce the topic and what I'm going to be talking about, which is mediumistic art. Now, some of you are probably familiar with this topic before I even begin talking about it. This is going to be an introduction to mediumistic art. The purpose of my lecture here is to attempt to define what this descriptive term really means, how it describes art, and also to put it in some context, to give it some context, both in relationship to my own work and historically. Now, I'm just going to look at something here. And then also, actually, I should mention something which is very important before I actually get this, get the ball rolling. At the very end of my talk, after I finish my actual lecture, I'm going to be doing a Q&A, and I believe you can ask me questions in the chat on YouTube. And Brian, who introduced me, will be reading your chat questions, and I'll be answering them and talking a little bit more in depth about the subject of mediumistic art and my own opinions and views on it. So the name of this lecture is Messages from the Outside, and I thought that it would be best for me to begin by showing you an example of my own work. This is a work that I did from last year. It's called Paths of Healing. As you can see, I'm also in my studio here as I'm doing this lecture. So I'm coming at this subject as someone who is a painter first and foremost. I did my master's in fine art at the Art Institute of Chicago many years ago in painting and drawing. Then I went on to do my second master's in art history at Brooklyn College. And there I wrote my thesis on spirit photographer William Mumler. So I had already, when I first began my master's work in art history, already had some interest in psychic phenomenon and its relationship to art and cultural objects. I wanted to show my work because I think it explains a little bit of how I came to this subject. So I should say, first and foremost, I don't consider myself or my own paintings to be mediumistic. I don't call myself a mediumistic artist. But in general, mediumistic artists don't really define themselves. They don't choose to be mediumistic artists or refer to themselves as that. Mediumistic art chooses its practitioners. So people who make mediumistic art do so unwillingly in many cases. I do, however, as an artist, as a maker of paintings, I do feel some kinship to mediumistic art and work that deals with metaphysical phenomenon. So this is what got me interested in this subject. And partly my work also, which you can see has an abstract language. The abstract language of my work, these crystalline shells and geometric forms, these relate to what I guess I could best describe as experiences in altered states, mystical experiences, if you want to call them that, and also experiences with phenomenon and states of mind that I just couldn't explain, most of which happened when I was very young, but some of which happened later. And at the very end of this talk, I'll discuss my work a little bit more in depth, but those experiences opened my mind up to the possibilities of things beyond the physical or material world. And it has guided and shaped both my painting, my work as a painter, and also my areas of research and my interests as an art historian and an art history writer. I'm also an art history teacher. I teach at a couple of colleges here in New York City where I am. But as an art history teacher, though, I stick more to a more mainstream academic history. I teach art history surveys. But I just wanted to say this a little bit also at the very beginning, because I think it's important to understand where I'm coming from. And everyone who talks about art from a certain angle gives their own version of history through their own lens. So I think that that's important to understand out of the gate. Now, the second thing that I really want to make clear at the very beginning of this is what mediumistic art is. So I'm going to offer you a bit of a definition for mediumistic art. You can see it up there on the screen. I also have here an image by Hilma of Klint and the mediumistic, the seance group that she belonged to called the Five, which was composed of Klint and 4 other women. I'm going to be talking about her more later. She's, of course, probably the most well-known of the mediumistic artists that I'll be talking about. But I wanted to offer this definition for you. Now, in general, classifications about art, attempts to pin down certain movements or certain descriptions of art are always very slippery. They're never broad enough, and they have all kinds of problematic text within them. So this definition here is really only to set some parameters for this talk so that you can understand the parameters that I'm working within and that this talk will be a little bit more clear. So I'm defining mediumistic art as really any kind of art: drawing, painting, music, even architecture. There are examples of mediumistic architecture where the person who creates this art alleges, states that the work does not actually come from them. It doesn't come from within, but it actually comes from without. It comes from the outside. And there is some kind of outside force, whether this is an intelligence, a supernatural entity, another aspect of their own inner mind, or forces of energy, as with Emma Kunz, who I'll talk about later. Whatever these forces are, they are outside of the artist themselves, and the artist does not claim responsibility for the works that they create. So they are a medium, as it were, a channel, a conduit for the energies that are coming through them, and the art that they're creating doesn't necessarily come from them. Excuse me. So what I'm saying here with mediumistic art in this definition is that there's a melting away of the ego when this work is created. When we look at these works, though I am going to talk about the biography and the biographical information of these artists, the biography is not what the artists are choosing to center in their work, but rather it is this force that is outside of them, compelling them and making them to work. And this is why I said earlier that artists who are mediumistic, who I could characterize as mediumistic, don't really call themselves mediumistic. It's something that we apply to them after the fact. They are unwilling participants in mediumship. So with that stated, I want to start looking at a few examples of historical mediumistic artists. And I think the best place to start is William Blake, the English poet and philosopher and printmaker and painter. And he, was a Renaissance man of the Romantic period from the late 18th century to the early 19th century. And, I'm using Blake as a starting point, but of course, mediumistic art is something that we can find if we look for it throughout time, going back to shamanistic cave paintings in the Paleolithic age. We can find evidence of some kind of mediumship in art going all the way back. But I'm starting with William Blake because his work ties into the religious movement that came out of America in the early 19th century, spiritualism. And spiritualism, I'm going to talk about a little bit more next. But it ties in pretty nicely because he was involved in practicing seances and rituals of this sort. So the works that I'm choosing to talk about here from Blake come out of a very particular mediumistic experiment that he performed with the watercolor painter and astrologer John Varley around 1818 or 1819. And Varley was interested in the occult, and he was interested in means of summoning spirits of the dead or spirits from the past, and using seances, which have been recorded going all the way back to the 18th century. And Varley, however, did not have the gift of vision. He did not have the gift of seeing things in his mind's eye psychically in the way that William Blake did. And William Blake, of course, had been gifted with paranormal visions or metaphysical visions from a very early age. When he was 8 years old, he famously had a vision of a tree that was filled with angels perching on the branches of the tree like a flock of birds. And Varley felt that he could use William Blake in a seance-like ritual and have Blake witness the spirits that he called forth during the seance. So in this seance, Varley conjured a number of different people, and Blake would look at them, and he would look at them as though he could actually see them there in the room, and then he would quickly make these very fast drawings, these psychic portraits of these individuals. Now, this one is very interesting because it's a non-human looking entity. On the lower right-hand side, you'll see Blake's pencil drawing of this spirit that he referred to as the ghost of a flea. And the ghost of a flea is from a whole series of these visionary heads that he made during the seances with Varley. And this was a spirit that Blake believed to be the spirit of a person who was particularly bloodthirsty in life, and then they were cursed by some kind of karmic fate to be incarnated as a tiny flea, scratching along the backs of dogs looking for blood. And this is why this being looks malformed and almost reptilian or monster-like. Now, on your left-hand side of the screen, this is a painting that Blake made later. It's a very small painting, but it's filled with all kinds of interesting detail. And here we see the ghost of a flea being rendered as something large and strong and monstrous, but also still very small. And it's gazing into this bowl that probably contains the blood that it craves. And behind it is a kind of cosmic theatrical setting that to me almost looks like the decorations you would see in a flea circus. I'm not really sure where that's supposed to be. But these were rendered by Blake right there in person, and Varley was very impressed by this. And William Blake, and a lot of the other artists early on in the 19th century experimenting with spiritualism and occultism, in a way give us the parameters for understanding what mediumistic art is. He sets the groundwork for this idea of an artist with gifted vision, with divine vision, that they are then transcribing into poetry or into visual art. So I like to use Blake as a kind of template for what mediumistic art is. Now I want to move on to an artist who actually was involved in spiritualist movements. And this is Anna Mary Howitt. And her mother actually was a famous poet. She wrote the poem, The Spider and the Fly. So her name might be familiar to some of you. She is an artist who gets interested in spiritualism. Her husband gets her into spiritualism. She starts performing seances. Now, before I go any further, I feel like I should define what spiritualism is for those of you who are not familiar. This is a religious movement. It arises from America in the early 19th century. Largely the Fox sisters, who are a group of two young women from upstate New York who can commune with the dead and communicate with them through rappings around 1848. The Fox sisters are generally pinpointed as being the beginning of the spiritualist movement. But the essence of this religion is that it is possible for humans to commune with the dead. But along with communing with spirits of the dead, sometimes there are higher, more elevated beings from other planes of existence, as well as the spirits of the dead. So Howitt becomes very interested in this. And while in trances during seances, she makes these spontaneous, very fluid, lyrical, looping compositions out of which are emerging faces and angels and religious figures and flowers and feathers and all of these colorful, decorative explosions, like the work that you're seeing here. Some have even said that the term automatic drawing might have first been applied to Anna Mary Howitt. Now, automatic drawing is something that comes directly out of spiritualism and this mediumistic practice of making art. Automatic drawing is the practice of making a drawing spontaneously without any conscious effort. So you just kind of go into a trance, go into a state, and then you very, spontaneously or blindly begin to render something on paper or on canvas. Now, this technique, of course, later on goes on to influence the surrealists in the early 20th century and many others. But Howitt is very interesting because she's not a self-taught, naive, or as some call it, outsider artist. I hate that term, outsider artist, but I use that term because a lot of you will know what I'm talking about. She's well-trained. She's well academically trained as a draftsperson. She is peers with Hunt and Rossetti and all of these members of the Pre-Raphaelite circle in England at the time. And she's someone who has a lineage of art historical understanding. So even though these works are made spontaneously, when I look at this drawing, there is still a kind of classicism in the sense that she's, you feel like a classical connection to Renaissance styles. There's something historical about the way that she's rendering these figures. That's less true with the next artist I want to talk about, Georgiana Houghton. Again, another English artist involved in spiritualism as well. And Houghton's work is really fantastic because here, about half a century before the earliest modern experiments with abstract art, we have works by Houghton made in pencil and watercolor on paper that are almost pure abstraction, almost as abstract as any work by Kandinsky or Mondrian. Now, Houghton begins by being interested in spiritualism. She starts getting into a trance during seances. She channels spirits, or she has visions of spirits. And her early renderings are much more representational. We see faces and floral motifs. And then later, as she progresses, they become increasingly more abstract towards the 1870s. Now, unfortunately, she did not receive the recognition she was due in her lifetime. Her abstractions were poorly received, though there was some praise, but it was not financially viable for her. She attempted to exhibit these drawings at her own expense, at a loss. And then sometime after that, she became involved personally and professionally with a spirit photographer, Frederick Hudson, who took the photograph that you're looking at here of Houghton with some kind of double exposed spirit in the background. And Hudson was later exposed as a fraud, as someone who was faking his alleged photographs of ghosts. So this didn't do very good things to Houghton's reputation, but she continued to make work until the end of her life. But unfortunately, Houghton, after these, disappointments in her life, withdrew from the public and withdrew from exhibiting her work. And it's only been in the last 10 or 15 years that these works have been rediscovered and have been reconsidered by more institutional academic currents in art history as perhaps precursors to modern abstraction. Now, someone who has certainly had a revival over the last few years is Hilma af Klint. And this is a Swedish artist who I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, especially if you're watching this video. Af Klint just recently had a major retrospective of her work. It was the largest exhibit of her work in America at the Guggenheim here in New York. And there was a documentary that came out just recently, I think last year. And I think that the popularity of af Klint has expanded beyond art institutions and academia and out into popular culture as well. So she's someone who you're probably very familiar with. Af Klint, of course, began with an interest in spiritualism to experiment in conducting seances with a group that called themselves the Five, composed of her and 4 other women. They made a lot of automatic drawings during this time. And it was from these experiments with the Five that af Klint came into contact with these high masters, or high lords, as she described them, who dictated to her a lot of the abstract forms that became part of the visual language of her later paintings. And these were coming out in automatic drawings like the one that I showed you at the very beginning of this talk. Now, these high masters also asked af Klint to begin preparing a series of paintings that would eventually grace a temple. The details of this temple and its architecture are a little sketchy, a little vague, though I've heard that it was intended to be a spiral-like structure, which is very similar to the Guggenheim, where she actually had her major exhibit, which is interesting. But for a few years between 1906 and 1915, af Klint was guided by these higher beings to create these large-scale paintings that are extremely abstract, that use geometric and flattened textures and geometric forms in order to represent spiritual states of being. This particular one belongs to a series called The 10 Largest, which conceptualizes each stage of a person's life using this abstract language that Klint had developed. Now, Klint did not really exhibit these works in her lifetime. She was not very aware of other modern innovations in abstraction that were going on. But I think it's interesting that her work, out of all of these artists, has become the most adopted by academic and institutional histories of art, because her work, when I look at this painting in particular, really does resonate with a lot of the modern experiments in painting that were going on at the time, not just Kandinsky and Mondrian, but I also think of Orphism and artists like František Kupka. When I look at this, these ideas of science and the spirit merging in this microcosm or macrocosm world, these resonate, these modern early 20th century themes resonate with her art. I do think that it is important to note that Klint, though, was not someone who was totally naive about the art world or what was going on in the avant-garde at the time. Her early works, those of you who saw them at the Guggenheim, her early works do look like post-impressionist or impressionist paintings. There's elements of the Nabi or Claude Monet in those works. And I feel that when I look at her paint handling and her color, there really is a sense that these works are informed by some awareness of modernism, of modern painting and the modern palette. That said, though, these works really were quite radical for their time, seemingly about half a decade before the first abstract paintings of Kandinsky. Now, what's also fascinating about Klint is that she did not want these works to be seen by the public. She felt that the public was not ready for them, that they were meant for the future, in some distant future. And she insisted in her will that these paintings not be displayed or open to the public until about 20 years after her death. And so it wasn't until the 80s that these works began to resurface, and there was this sense of revelation at the time. And that surprise and that revelation has only increased since then. So perhaps she was right, and this moment in the future is the proper time for these paintings. Now, another artist who prefigures abstraction in some ways, or echoes what's going on in modern art during the 20th century, but who is creating work totally outside of institutional ideas about modern art, is the Swiss artist Emma Kunz. Now, Emma Kunz had an ability to sense fields of energy, so she claimed what's known as radiesthesia. And this is someone who's not just sensitive to spirits or psychic states, but also fields of energy, such as magnetic or radioactive fields of energy, or more occult ideas such as telluric forces that come from the earth and so forth. And Kunz claimed that these drawings of hers, like the one you're seeing here, that are made with technical precision on pieces of graph paper, were guided by her intuition of these energy fields. What's interesting about Kunz and a lot of the other mediumistic artists is they aren't making these works for an art historical context. They're not making them for a gallery or a museum context. These works instead are being made usually for metaphysical or personal purposes. And with Kunz's work, these were not meant to be hung on the walls of galleries and appreciated for their color and form, but rather they were actually meant as devices of healing, almost a kind of spiritual technology, and that by being in proximity to the drawing or looking at the drawing, one could actually experience a sort of inner healing or inner metaphysical recharge. Now, this takes me to another interesting mediumistic artist, a medium who is best known by the name Helene Smith. She's a Swiss artist. That's not her real name, though. Helene Smith is known by that name through a famous book by the psychology professor Theodore Flournoy, who wrote this book called From India to the Planet Mars. And really fascinating book, by the way, which I recommend anyone who's interested in discovering and exploring more, check out. And Flournoy was interested in Smith because she could channel identities from past incarnations. And once she went into a trance state or medium state, she could speak in other languages. Apparently, she could remember past worlds and past lives. And of all of these past lives and identities that she called forth from her past, probably the most extraordinary was as a ancient Martian on Mars in the distant past. And when Smith went into this trance, she could actually speak and write in this kind of automatic language that did not correspond to any known language that she claimed was Martian, that she claimed was a Martian language. And you can see an example of it on the left-hand side of your screen there. This is something that really fascinates me a great deal. A common theme through a lot of the artists we'll be looking at, Smith, J.B. Murray, and Madge Gill, is this ability to write and speak in an entirely hermetic language that doesn't seem to come from anywhere. Now, also when Smith came out of these trance states, she also could recall the flora and fauna of the Martian landscape, and she would make paintings and renderings of these memories of the past. And one of these Martian landscapes is down below with very strange plant and animal form. I don't know what those look like, alien emu or something like that. Smith is also, and the book From India to the Planet Mars is also very important from an art historical perspective, because of course this becomes a major influence for the experiments of the surrealists who are making work just about concurrently with Smith, or they're beginning to experiment concurrently with Smith. And a lot of her work in automatic drawing and automatic writing influences their experiments of art making. Now, the other artists that I want to talk about, and again, a lot of these, just like Smith paralleling modern developments, a lot of these artists, even though they are completely outside of institutional ideas about modern art or academic ideas about modern art, they share some kinship or influence or mutual influence. And this is also true of Augustin Lesage. And Lesage was a coal miner in France. And around 1911, at the age of 35, he was in the mine and he heard a voice from deep in the darkness of the mine. And it spoke to him and it told him that he was going to become a painter. And he followed these voices. The voices didn't stop. They continued to pursue him and direct him in his work. And he followed the advice of these voices. He bought paints on its mandate. He bought canvases. He ended up working almost exclusively in large-scale canvases and producing, under the direction of this voice, works like what you see here on the left, these large-scale, geometric, obsessive pieces that, for me, echo technology and architecture just as much as biological forms. Now, when I look at a work like this, The Spirit of the Pyramids, I'm reminded of other self-taught artists like Adolf Wolfi, with their obsession with repetition and the horror vacui, the need to fill all the space. But Lesage has a completely different sense of control and order over these works. Symmetry abounds in every image. There's a sense of design and purpose behind these works. Now, what's interesting is that Jean Dubuffet, a well-known modern artist at the time and the founder of the Art Brut movement, began including Lesage's paintings in Art Brut exhibits, and Dubuffet himself was a collector of his work. So Lesage, unlike a lot of these other artists, did find his way into the context of modern art at the time. Now, this brings me to another artist. And with each one of these artists, I selected them because I believe that they represent in their own way a different aspect of the mediumistic experience. And with the English artist Madge Gill, something that I want to address is that her creations and her communing with the spirit, Minorest or Minorest, the spirit that she called Minorest, which sounds a lot like my inner rest, which you can make of that what you want. With Madge Gill, her works seem to come out of, or her mediumistic experiences seem to come out of experiences of trauma and pain. She had a very difficult life. She was an orphan. She moved around a great deal from different homes. She had an aunt who she eventually came to live with, who was interested in spiritualism and may have been the first to plant this idea of spiritualism in her mind. And then she had three sons and and then after giving birth to three sons, she had a miscarriage, a daughter who died at birth. And this experience for her was not only personally traumatic and emotionally painful, it was also physically very damaging to herself. Gill herself almost did not survive this pregnancy. She was left blind in one eye after this pregnancy. And sometime after this traumatic experience is when she began communicating with Minorest and creating these obsessively textured, detailed drawings, typically similar to what you're seeing here on the screen, where there is an all-over composition and every corner is covered. And she produced these and began to expand on them more and more as a kind of therapy and also as a kind of exorcism of this spirit within her that was compelling her to make these works. Her works, some of them are, maybe I'll show you a picture from a book I have, but after this talk, but some of these works are 30, 40 feet across. She would make these monstrous pieces, some of them painted on fabric, some of them embroidered. Really, you're looking at a pen drawing here, but she worked in a variety of materials until later in life when her first son died in an accident and Madge Gill retreated from any public life or public exhibiting of her work. But at the end of her life, of course, after her death, among her personal effects were found thousands and thousands of drawings like these. So she left behind her a massive legacy of these works that are very haunting and filled with these spectral faces and characters and forms that, we can speculate as to what they're meant to represent. Now, this brings me to an American artist. We're moving a little later in the timeline, and this is John Bunyan Murray, or better known as J.B. Murray, sometimes just called J.B. Murray. J.B. Murray is a tenant farmer from Georgia, so he rents land and he cultivates the land for profit. And he had a wife and he had 11 children, and all of his children had gone off. And then his wife left him when he was about in his 50s. He was in middle age. And Murray was alone on his farm, supporting himself when he first began to explore and experiment in art. And Murray began by building lawn sculptures, piles of rocks and sanctuaries and talismans that he would build around his lawn as a way of maybe warding off evil or containing good energy within. Now, this use of this building of rock piles and shrines on a lawn, that can be tied to certain Southern folk art traditions, and they are very in keeping with that folk art tradition. They have a lot of religious and moral content to them. The yard show, which is a way that a lot of Southern folk artists would create art to impress or amuse their neighbors. But then Murray, around 1978, has a vision while he's out farming in the field where he's just blinded by this light from the sun, and he sees an eagle coming out of the sun, and then this halo appears and the spirit of his mother, who was deceased, appears before him. And he says that at this time, when there is this manifestation of this sun energy, he was given the ability to make paintings that he refers to as his letters, or as these divine letters. And they're very typically like the work that you're seeing on the screen here. They have an all-over composition. There's lots of bright colors. There's a whole variety of different kinds of mark making that's explored. This one has a little bit more of a figurative or facial imagery embedded in it than a lot of his other works. But to J.B. Murray, these were not just representations or mediumistic works. These were a language. These were a kind of mystical, metaphysical language that was given to him by a spiritual or angelic source, by the energy of the sun. Now, he claimed that with a bottle of holy water, which you see him holding there in the picture, with a bottle of holy water, and this holy water pulled from a well on his property, he could use that water, that bottle, as a kind of decrypting tool, as a kind of lens through which he could read and decipher these images. It's interesting to note also that J.B. Murray was illiterate. He could not read or write. So the idea that he was intuiting or understanding these abstract forms as a language, as if it was speaking to him, a kind of written gospel, an encoded gospel, is very interesting. This is something that maybe isn't physical, but a language existing on a metaphysical plane. What I also find interesting about this description is it reminds me a lot of John Dee and Edward Kelly, and the use of scrying tools like scrying crystals to decipher the angelic language of Enochian. In a way, this is sort of J.B. Murray's Enochian. This is his angelic language that he's deciphering. The use of a crystal or a water or a mirror or something like that, it has a long history in occult practices going way back. I'm not sure if J.B. Murray would have known of that history, probably not. So this might be something that's more intuitive and ingrained in the human spirit. Now, this brings me to the last artist that I want to talk about, and this is Paulina Peavy, who during a seance in 1932 contacted a spirit that she called Lacamo. And Lacamo, she claims, came in the form of a glowing UFO or a flying saucer of sorts. And this, and she believed that actually the UFOs that people had been seeing in the news at this time, that were popular in the media, were actually spirits of ascended beings who had left the material plane. And that the UFO, this mechanical seeming form that was self-illuminated, was only how we as physical beings could perceive figures and spirits that were beyond physical description, that were beyond physical manifestation, which jives a little bit with Carl Jung's ideas about flying saucers as archetypal symbols. So under the direction of Lacamo, Peavy starts making paintings. Now, Peavy was a trained painter, and I think you can see in this work here on the left some influence maybe of modern art at the time. I look at this and I see Lesage, I see a little Duchamp and Cubism, and I see those elements where the metaphysical and the mechanical are brought together. Also, what's interesting about Peavy is that she would wear costumes when making these paintings and channeling Lacamo. And I like that she used masks and costumes on her body as a way of transforming herself, transforming her identity, as if by changing your external being, you can better allow some outside force to come through within you. Now, this brings me to the end of the talk. This is another painting of mine. I thought I might mention my own work again. All of these artists are only a small selection of mediumistic art. It would take me much longer to do a more comprehensive lecture on the topic. My hope is that by presenting these, you understand a few of the artists that I personally feel a kinship with as an artist. And I hope that this lecture gave you a clearer understanding of some of the parameters of mediumistic art and some of the ways this description of art could be defined or viewed. And with that, I think I'm going to end this talk. And if you want to do some question and answer, you can ask me questions in the chat on YouTube. And Brian Shadester is going to read them to me, and I can do my best to perhaps give informed sounding answers to them. Are we ready to do some Q&A, Brian?
Yes, we are.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. Thanks everyone for tuning into this. And we can, maybe if there's any questions, or if you have any questions, Brian, we can just talk about that for the remainder of the time.
Okay. So anyway, I wanted to thank you for what David Lynch might describe as a really beautiful talk. And since David's work on Twin Peaks is going to come up later today for the Brooklyn Antiquarian Fair, I had to switch over to my glasses so that I can actually read some of the comments as they come in, but I'm not on screen right now anyway, so that's okay. So we had a comment / question from Mr. Queenlib noting that the Martian automatic writing looks similar to Inuit or Northern American writing. And I was sort of wanting to, you know, kind of go with that as well, in recognizing the influence of spiritualism on science fiction in general, and especially some of the early science fiction and spiritualist writers of the early 20th century. The two seem to cohere much earlier than, you know, historically it's recognized in sort of the late 60s, early 70s, when ancient alien theory comes into vogue. And this will come up in another one of our talks tomorrow, actually, on the anomaly. But maybe you can talk a little bit about the association between this outer space.
Yes. I have two thoughts. First, addressing science fiction, there is, you know, again, this lecture couldn't include every aspect of mediumistic art, but there does seem to be this transition in channeling and mediumship that happens after the technological boom of the two world wars, where we move from spiritualism, where you have disembodied non-physical entities from another realm, into a more technology or science-based extraterrestrial cosmology related to mediumship. So in that sense, I do think that there's something interesting that happens both with Paulina Peavy and then Ionel Talpazon, who's another amazing artist that I would describe as mediumistic, that I was almost going to include here. And it's almost as if the language, as we move into the 21st century, at least in the Western world, becomes more science-based and technological when referring to this non-physical realm. So there is a crossover for sure. I don't know if it's because we now have a different set of language, like, you know, the language of quantum mechanics and digital technology. So we can now talk about spiritual realms using those descriptive terms, or if it is because there has been some cultural shift where that seems more relevant or more plausible than 19th century spiritualism. So maybe that answers your question. Oh, and then the second thing that I was thinking about, the mention of Inuit or native or non-Romance languages. I also cuneiform comes to mind when I look at those. I also wanted to say that we can find mediumship. This really doesn't relate to that comment. It just made me think of this statement I wanted to make. We can find mediumship in every culture from every period of time if we really look for it. I avoided things like referring to shamanistic cultures as creating mediumistic art, because I feel that is maybe unfair to those perspectives on channeling and spiritual possession and things like that. But you can find aspects of this phenomenon. And mediumistic art is really more than just an art form. It's also a phenomenon. And you can find this in really non-spiritualist circles. You can find this in any culture or any time if you really look for it. Those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, as you were talking, it kind of got me thinking about how this particular genre is in some ways almost a cultural or creative reaction to you know enlightenment thinking and scientific positivism. It seems like there's almost an immediate backlash that happens as that starts to become more in the mainstream in terms of culture and politics in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And I wonder if you think, and I know I'm asking you something that maybe you haven't really looked that deeply into at this point, but maybe you're thinking that these artists were really looking around them and sort of seeing a broader problem that their creativity was kind of seeking to solve in a way, not just being alternative for alternative's sake.
Oh, I definitely think that all of these artists became involved in occult or spiritualist practices out of some kind of a need, whether that be because there was some lacking in their personal life or because they saw maybe a discontentment with the conditions of the modern world, of modern life. I do think there is a longing that begins first and then moves into exploring these metaphysical realms. But to your statement, though, there definitely, I'm sure that there is a connection. I don't know if I can make it, with empirical evidence, but I definitely think there's a connection between the Enlightenment towards the end of the 18th century and the beginning of spiritualism in America, and then its popularity throughout Europe subsequently at the beginning of the 19th century in the 1840s. And also all of the other new and novel religions that emerged from the burned over district in upstate New York during that time as well. There was a lot of other spiritual paths that emerged at that time that were brand new. And I think that was a kind of looking for answers to questions that Enlightenment thinking and positivist thinking didn't have answers for. There were certain questions that just couldn't be answered. And likewise, when we see it emerging in the popular culture as it is now, certainly I think it's fair to say that mediumship and the occult have had a moment in the 21st century or in the past during the world wars, during the two world wars at the beginning of the 20th century. I think at those times, there was a feeling of dissatisfaction with a purely positivistic perspective on the universe, a materialistic, empiricism only kind of perspective that led people to explore these realms.
Yeah.
If that explains your...
No, it's a great explanation. And I want to kind of bring that into the present maybe, because we have a few questions from Shauna Carter and Martha Rand about your own spiritual or meditative preparation for your painting and also your working process. And I kind of wanted to maybe bring up the idea that, once again, not just in between the wars, but now, with a lot of what's going on in the contemporary world in terms of racial strife and disparity and income inequality and things like that, and wars and the NSA and the spying and all the runaway technology, whether you think that and how this parlays into your own work, whether you think that we're in a time now where there is sort of a spiritual emptiness that can be solved through this type of artwork or through these kind of practices. I think it was, you mentioned Jung earlier, who talked about the need for religion and spirituality to actually be a major component in psychological healing. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your process, both inner and your working process.
Yes, for sure. I'd love to. I could talk about my art all day. I try to not talk about it too much. I do think, though, that I do think that a alternative perspective on the metaphysics of the universe does have some potential for healing us now as a culture. I don't know if I can give you that answer, though, right now. That's almost too big of a topic to wrestle with. It would require a great deal of consideration before I made statements about what direction we should go in. But I do think some answers are in these alternative spiritualities, avoiding, of course, the dogma of religion or cult-like following of any particular path. I think that's always a trap that people could get into. I personally, and I'll talk a little bit about my own perspectives, I personally have come to try to not fix my beliefs in any one particular way. My influences metaphysically for both my work and my personal life have come from a lot of different perspectives. Recently, some philosophical influences for me have been the artist Osman Spare, and the idea that one can commune with almost a higher self, your Kia, or your self outside of your body, and this will communicate with you and tell you things that your physical waking self can't maybe see clearly through the fog of material existence. But for my own paintings, I should clarify this a little bit, because I kind of just sort of teased it in the lecture and I didn't want to spend too much time talking about it. But my work has evolved very slowly over years and years, over 20 plus years. And the work that I'm making now has really only been my focus for the past 5 years. So not very long. And before that, I was experimenting with other approaches to art making. But always my work has circled around different experiences that I had when I was younger that affected my perspective on the universe. These were experiences that were both induced by who knows what, that were sort of spontaneous. Some of them were induced by experimenting with psychedelic drugs when I was younger. And a lot of these were not visual purely, but they were information based, like information that I received in my mind. And they were experiential. They weren't something that was just like, oh, I saw a giant orb and then I could translate that directly to you visually, but they were more complicated, where I sort of experienced diagrammatic renderings of the universe and reality, and mapped onto these schematics that were like the Kabbalistic tree of life and so forth. But my art today is something that I've arrived at as a abstract language, very similar to the way in which Hilma of Klint works, where she, through her experiences, she then began to develop an abstract language. So I've kind of developed this abstract language based on these ideas and these experiences. And this is what I've tried to describe and piece together in my art. I will say, though, once I started making these works and getting this language down pat, the imagery just kind of flooded my mind and just continues to sort of flow from me. I almost don't even really have to consciously think about what my next painting is going to be. It's sort of there as soon as I'm finishing the last one. And nowadays I'm working on 4 or 5 different paintings all at once. And what happens is, and this will maybe explain it, is actually I do have a kind of visionary experience before starting a painting, but I hesitate to describe that because it sometimes sounds like I'm trying to make it more mystical or more mysterious than it is. But it's really just, whatever these things are, the entire composition and arrangement appears to me very spontaneously, almost as soon as I'm done with whatever I've been working on. And then I do make very quick, spontaneous drawings that I then later try to harness and do justice to in my paintings. And when I get into these paintings, there is a meditative state that I do enter into, where the slate in my mind is wiped clean. And I, sometimes days and time will pass and I'll forget about them. Yeah, I think if that maybe makes it a little bit more clear of what my relationship is. I don't call myself a mediumistic artist, But as you can tell, there's a lot of ways in which I relate to mediumistic artists, and more than a lot of other modern approaches to art making. Anyway, I hope that answered some questions.
Well, I wrote about your art maybe 5 years ago when you were sort of coming out of a surrealist kind of way of making, doing
Yes.
automatism and finding figures in it using colors and using techniques and strokes. And I was really amazed that you moved into a more refined and symmetrical and geometrical way of putting together your images. And it's been amazing to see you grow. I'm holding here an actual mediumistic artwork by an artist from Los Angeles in the 1950s named Bert Schomburg. And as you were saying, I think we are participating in, the unified field of consciousness at all times, whether we're conscious of it or not. And so we have, kind of transcendent experiences that happen to us without us pushing ourselves to have them through hallucinogenic plants or drugs or meditation or whatever. So sometimes it can come out of just daydreaming or the everyday process or whatnot. And I think, we have a linguistic question, and this will be our last one, then we have to wrap it up, from Cosmo Sapien, who's made a lot of very nice comments in the chat box. And he was sort of asking, how do you differentiate between this sort of like deranged experience and the kind of like desire to have a spiritualist experience that can be captured in art? And maybe that comes down to the question that you were sort of trying to go into before about these different categories and how they flow back and forth into each other sometimes, and the usefulness, sort of useless need to have terms like outsider art.
Yeah, so I take that question to be, how do we determine a mediumistic state versus maybe someone who has mental illness or is hallucinating in some way? Or how do, also another way I can take that question is, how do these artists take an ecstatic experience that can sometimes be chaos to the mind and create some kind of order out of that in their artwork? And I'll answer both of those. I think that there is always a thin line between, people who have mental illness and psychic conditions. My personal criteria for mediumistic art is that the artist says that what they are doing does not come from their own ego, but comes from somewhere outside of them. And if they are shown to have mental illness or personal trauma or some other kind of condition that might be causing that effect, I'm not as concerned with that. It's me taking the artist at their word for where they say the origin of their work comes from. Now, the second thing is because, ecstatic states are chaotic. The strange experiences I had, I didn't think to stop and start drawing or anything. I didn't think to, try to videotape it or something like that. A lot of times the trance state or the ecstatic state is, chaos to the mind. It can be disturbing. It can be arresting. And some people have these experiences, but then also just can't transcribe it into art. And I think it's interesting that actually half or maybe more than half of the artists that I showed you in this presentation are not actually self-taught artists. They have some background or some training as artists. So their brain and their mind is already developed with that, that habit or that intuition to create art or to render something visually. And I think that helps with people like Klint or Peavy, Paulina Peavy, because you can see that they're able to communicate an experience that might be non-visual, that might be ineffable, intangible. They're able to transform that into something visual and concrete because they have this kind of artistic background or this artistic experience. Now, then you do have people like J.B. Murray who are completely self-taught though and make beautiful works of art. And we just have to wonder, are their hands controlled by some force? or is this pure intuition, something about the artistic spirit? And this is something else I want to get into on a tangent here, is that the thing about mediumistic art is a lot of times in academic and institutional conversations about art, art is thought of as this rational left brain process that has to be responding to history or responding to critique or responding to culture. Mediumistic art is in some ways art for art's sake. It's art for the sake of the spirit or the creator or the self, because it's art that doesn't have any external justification. Its only justification is that some ineffable force has willed the artist to create it. Anyway, just a thought. What?
Definitely non-neoliberal.
Yeah, it's extremely, it's extremely out there.
Marketing, but we do need to wrap it up, and I, could go on with you forever. I have so many more questions, particularly about the amount of actual female artists that seem to be pioneers in this genre, but that'll have to remain for another
very interesting
another go around about this. But that was one thing that struck me, and maybe that was one of the reasons why so much of this art had been dismissed through the years, and
very
maybe
likely
coming into prominence for that reason as well. But I wanted to mention real quick, on Walkabout Books booth number 4, they actually have a book called Thoughts from the Inner Life from 1886, a first edition. And also there's a book called The Ghost of My Friends, Ghost Patterns Found in Autographs That Smudge from 1905, a very limited run. So go ahead and to all of our viewers, go to brooklynbookfair.com, click onto the virtual fair, and check out booth 4 and booth 145 for some material that's related to the mediumistic genre that we've just had so wonderfully described by Alessandro Keegan. And so thank you again, Alessandro. I noticed that you have a ring on your finger now. So have you guys
just recently married? Yes.
Congratulations.
Thanks. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone who tuned in, and thank you especially to Alessandro. As always, it was amazing. I'm blown away by your growth from when we were in grad school and reading papers to now your lecturing ability from being a art history teacher as well as a great artist. So,
well, thank you very much, Brian, and thank you for having me. I really enjoyed being able to talk about this subject. And thanks for everyone for checking it out.
As the Beach Boys said, let's do it again.
That sounds good.
Talk to you
All
soon.
right.
Bye, Alessandro.
See ya.